Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About the Middle East. I'm Juliana Misheyev. On this show, we talk about the Middle East, its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region. We hope to promote open and honest discussion and to humanize the conflict by getting to know people who have a stake in the issues. You're listening to WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton. The opinions and views expressed on Let's Talk About the Middle East are strictly those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station manager, the board of directors, or anyone else affiliated with WSLR. Disability Rights Florida launches the Access the Vote campaign. Disability Rights Florida has launched its Access the Vote campaign to encourage Floridians with disabilities to vote in upcoming elections. The campaign includes a new accessible website. The website is www.accessthevote.org, detailing the voting rights and responsibilities for all Floridians. Learn more at www.disabilityrightsflorida.org. Our interview today is with Professor Joseba Zulaika. He is an anthropologist and professor at the University of Nevada Center for Basque Studies, and he's written extensively about counterterrorism in the United States. Our discussion centers around the U.S. war on terror and the relatively recent phenomena of drone warfare. Here is our interview with Professor Joseba Zulaika. So thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Zulaika.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great. I want to start by talking about the war on terror. The United States declared its war on terror after September 11th in the attacks in 2001. 14 years later, the effort has arguably been unsuccessful. The Taliban hold more territory today in Afghanistan than it did when the U.S. invaded it in 2001, and the rise of ISIS has been partially attributed to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Do you have an explanation for why the war on terror has been a failure?
Well, you can find many reasons why, but I think at the origin of it, at the beginning of it, is the fact of even the very declaration of this was a war on terror. I find it was rather misguided. I mean, these were after all people with box cutters, suicidal people with box cutters, and the greatest army in the history of mankind to declare a war against these people living in caves and in a very primitive type of life. To declare war is just to give them legitimacy. It is to empower them. So I think that very act, to reply to the heinous crime of 9/11 in itself, I think it was misguided. Then you go with the definition of terrorism, and you put the whole situation in a situation defined as terroristic, and not just as an issue of historical, cultural, religious grievances, etc., but just a terrorist issue. And you are likely to end up deluding yourself that they have no claim to anything, that they are all terrorists. And so that's how you start, and then that's how you go into self-delusions like going to the war in Iraq with these false pretenses. And it is one after another because of your own wrong answer to that crime of 9/11. So I think that was at the very beginning of it all. And something like the Iraq War was obviously a tremendous fiasco, like everybody recognizes now. The number we give of Iraqis killed, the official number we always read is 150 to 200,000, but there are other estimates like the one by the Hopkins Bloomberg School that puts it into 650,000 people. So imagine the catastrophe and the disaster that you yourself are in a way creating in response to the heinous crime of 9/11. And then comes ISIS and the Syrian war, and we are in the midst of it. I think at the origin of it is this intellectual mistake of not seeing the reality of it and then compounding with these disaster decisions. But at the origin of it, for me, it is this definition: we are in a war, in an endless, perpetual war, and they are all terrorists. Unlike that, you are not likely to ever end the war because you are unable to face them for what they really are. So I think that is, for me, what is at the origin of this.
And can you just elaborate as a follow-up, face them for what they really are? What are they really, would you say?
Well, they're just desperate people who live in poverty, like the whole Pakistani tribal Muslim areas. And actually, a lot of this war on terror is a war against the poorest of the poor, either in Yemen, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. It's just all the poorest of the poor tribal societies, with some of them, like in Pakistan, with a literacy rate of 3%. So we're just bombarding and attacking these. You have to see them for what they are, just people living their own way of life that is not like ours, but you have to deal with them the way they are. They are not just terrorists that you are going to go to clean the territories with drones, no?
So you write in your work about the, quote, self-fulfilling quality of counterterrorism policy. Can you elaborate on this concept?
And my view on this, and I published a book with that title, Terrorism, the Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, excuse me, my view of it is that counterterrorism decisively contributes to terrorism. And there are many examples. And just to take one, since we are talking about the Iraq War, when the U.S. authority was established after the invasion, immediately there was a question of what to do with Saddam Hussein's army, Saddam Hussein's institutions. And there was a decision, an awful decision, with an entirely terroristic mindset, that all of the soldiers and all of the teachers and doctors that had been part of Saddam Hussein's national institutions, they should all be eliminated. So that created hundreds of thousands of potential terrorists, potential combatants, militants, overnight. Because in your mentality, they were contaminated by Saddam Hussein's evil. It is this kind of mentality that you end up provoking more of the sin that you dread. But you could go, I apply this concept also very much to like what happened in 9/11. By action and by omission, the counter-terrorist state here in the U.S. did a lot to make that possible. We start talking about any conspiracy theory. There was a lot that went into the actors of 9/11 since the time they had been fighting with the U.S. in the Reagan times in Afghanistan in the 80s to the arrest and trial against the blind sheikh, which was the initial attack against the towers. The New York Times considered that trial kind of a sham, and that led in part to the fatwa that later was given by the blind sheikh, but also the immense failure of intelligence to not catch the 9/11 terrorists, when for months and months, like 20 months, they had the names of two of them, the CIA had the names, that they wouldn't catch them, that it was a massive failure that comes partly by this mindset of counterterrorism, that these are just idiots incapable of doing anything like that. It's like the system itself unconsciously is kind of provoking it in a way. So I think the counterterrorism really has to be taken into account when we talk of terrorism. And in different national settings, there are many cases in which, and I think what is happening now with drones, it has been acknowledged by many military men here in the U.S., that actually may end up provoking more of the blowback, etc., etc.
Along with the seemingly endless wars in the Middle East, the United States war on terror has led to the unjust imprisonment of Muslim people accused of terrorism. Can you talk about how these people are found guilty of committing terrorism? Are they given a fair trial?
Well, all you need to do is read this book that was published last year by Trevor Aronson, called The Terror Factory. And he analyzes every single trial case of terrorism in the U.S., these foiled terrorist plots we hear about every month or other month in the evening news. They open always with these dreadful terrorism plot foils. He examines all of them, the decade 2001 and 2011, every single one of them. And he comes to the conclusion that of the 508 people that in American prisons were at the time in 2011 categorized as terrorists, of those 508, all of them, with the exception of three of them were actually terrorists that had tried to blow a bomb or kill somebody. The other 505, they were all created by the FBI in a sting operation associated with informers or informants that usually are former criminals. And so the U.S. actually had created these hundreds of terrorists that, if not for this sting operation by the FBI, they would have never done anything. So these are people who had some problem with the law. Their visa has been extended, or they had some information against them that they threatened them if they didn't become their informants, or some of them are borderline people on the edge. So they just made these fake trials, and basically they created them so that the billions of dollars that are spent in counterterrorism are justified to the public. But just think of it, 505 out of 500, they were all created by the FBI. This is what the book shows, case after case. Trevor Aronson, the title is, the book is The Terror Factory. It's just a shame. And the media must know about this, but they will keep us threatening of making us being scared every other month with some foil plot when they know it is just a complete fabrication by the FBI.
Right, and you're talking about Trevor Aronson. He is an investigative journalist. He writes for The Intercept. And this book, The Terror Factory, I hadn't heard about the fact that there are these terror factories that actually create terrorists and that act as informants. So you're saying that the FBI actually has a hand in creating the very problem that the United States is claiming that they're trying to solve.
That's exactly the conclusion he comes to. And not only him, quite a few former policemen, former officers tell him that that's what they are doing. A lot of it is created by counterterrorism in order to justify, in part, the massive amount of billions of dollars that counterterrorism takes.
It seems like a lot of the discourse and fear-mongering comes before the actual threat of terrorism. That is to say that the industry is built around this idea that terrorism is an imminent threat because people stand to benefit from, more war, more weapons, and then that threat becomes a reality.
That's part of the self-fulfilling quality of it, that you define a situation in terms that you end up provoking it. It's like Al-Qaeda in Iraq. When we went to Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but then, of course, it was created. You yourself create the phenomenon you want to fight. So there is, I think, a lot of that goes on. And we have such an enormous military establishment that we compulsively need an enemy, and we end up creating it.
I want to shift gears and talk about drone warfare, which is another topic you've written extensively about. President Obama has embraced the vast expansion of drone strikes against alleged militants and terrorists. Can you talk about how this has changed the nature of warfare and the ethics of war?
Well, the ethics of war, if you read ethicists, they will tell you that basically in the history of war, it was the fact that you are confronted your enemy, and it was whether you killed the enemy or the enemy killed you, that in a way kind of justified that you in self-defense had to kill your enemy. But that logic that was at the cornerstone of the ethics of war completely disappears when you're just shooting from an unmanned vehicle in the air, and you know that the one down below has no access to shoot back at you. So there is this sense that you're just killing in the sense of shooting into a fishbowl or shooting into hunting of an animal. And actually, at the door of the creature base, the logo is the home of the hunters. So there is a sense in which this is very much like hunting, with all the categorical premises that implies that you are actually shooting at animals down there, and that's how they are categorized regularly in the reports that some of these former pilots write about. So there is a sense in which the whole ethics, but also the whole strategy changes with the drones, precisely because you're just killing people technologically from a distance when they have no access to replicate. And so there is a deep change in the whole morality and the whole legality of warfare that we're just beginning to understand right now.
You mentioned briefly in your response that the testimonies of former pilots. Can you talk a little bit about those testimonies and what they said?
I listened to Sean Westmoreland last March in Las Vegas, who belongs to the famous Westmoreland family. He at one point got the PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome, because he realized that what he was doing was killing innocent civilians. And he asked his superiors to tell him how many of the people they had killed were actually civilians, and he didn't get a reply. So he investigated on his own, and he came to the conclusion that in 2009, when he was feeding one of these drones, each drone has like 170 people feeding information to them, he found that in 1 year he had been involved in the killing of 359 innocent civilians. So imagine for him became kind of traumatic, and so there is in a way you need to keep a lot of fantasy to sustain the idea that the people you are killing down there by signature strike like many of them. That is people who are at a certain time in a certain space, and by definition, if they are male, they are all actual or potential terrorists. To keep this fiction, you need a lot of blindness. And one of the things that these pilots in the drones have is that they are watching hours and days to their future victims, and they find out that they have children, they find out that they are living in what kind of situation they are living in their homes, and they end up kind of knowing too much about them, so they cannot sustain the fantasy that they are all murderous terrorists. They come to realize they're just normal human beings like the rest of us. So then they become aware of what they are doing, so they become traumatized by it.
Let's talk about that sort of fantasy involved in knowing who a drone strikes. How are the decisions made about, where to target drones? How certain is the United States military that they are hitting their desired target? Is it based on any sort of accurate assessment? How is that decision made?
Well, most of them, they are what they call signature strikes. So you basically know nothing about the people you are shooting at, not even the name. Not long ago, of the 4,000 people killed, they knew the names of 125. So these are people about which you know nothing. And so obviously you have to imagine they are all actual or potential terrorists. So you need a huge act of imagination and supposition to assume that they are all terrorists, but that's how they define them. So you are basically ignorant of them.
Right. And this year, the Obama administration released the long-anticipated internal assessment of the number of civilians killed by drone strikes in nations where the U.S. is not officially at war. According to the data, between 64 and 116 civilians were killed in the United States drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya during Obama's 8 years in office. And this figure was lower than even the most conservative estimates. Do you think we can trust that these figures are accurate?
It's just astonishing, the power of the politicians, including the best politicians, and Obama is, for me, one of the very best. He's the only politician I ever voted for, that they have this capacity to lie to us as if we are all idiots. I don't understand. I mean, it's just amazing for me that Obama would say that there are 46 when, the most conservative estimates have on the run of 1,000 civilians and over 200 children. This was just 2-3 years ago, these were estimates. And that he would come with 40. I just don't understand. Who they think they are deluding. But there is an enormous self-delusion in all of these numbers. Brennan said in 2010 or 11 that we hadn't killed one single civilian in 1 year. And so you have to decide whom to believe, to Brennan or to Sean Westmoreland when he says that he found out that he had killed 359 innocent civilians, and as a result of it, he's traumatized. So you decide whom to believe, but it's astonishing, and I think that's very much part of this whole discourse of terrorism and the tabuization of terrorism. Like the other people, they are not human beings like us. Like they must be some kind of animals that have no morality, no ethics of nothing. And that's just, in the end, it's not that it's just unjust. Of course it is unjust, but it is also completely self-blinding. You don't see the issues, you don't see the problems if you don't want to relate to the real people you are fighting and killing, as if they don't have their own life, they don't have their families, they don't have their own nothing. So it is this self-delusional quality of counterterrorism in so many ways. But this is in a way a continuation of the self-delusion quality of the whole Cold War also. I mean, how can we understand that we engaged in these decades of Cold War, of tens and tens of nuclear warheads pointing at each other? There was a totally a delirium in the whole process that the very people who are involved in it recognize and write about. It was a delirium. It's just a complete fantasy reality that is hard to understand, but it is at the core of this military culture.
My last question, which I think is really relevant to what's happening right now with the election. We hear a lot about Syria and we hear a lot about Russia, particularly a lot of Russia blaming rhetoric on both sides. After years of allegedly fighting terrorism in Syria, the United States has made very few gains. A year after Russia sent in its air force, it seems to be accomplishing what the U.S. was unable to. So they have their form of counterterrorism that seems to have been successful. Could you talk about why this might be? How does Russian counterterrorism differ from counterterrorism in the United States?
Well, I cannot tell you much about how Russian counterterrorism is. I haven't studied that. But what is becoming obvious is that a new kind of Cold War is developing between Russia and the United States. And I just read this book by William Perry, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. And William Perry is second to none in the knowledge of all the military systems that were taken in place since the 60s. He was very much at the middle of it all as Subsecretary of State of Defense with Carter and Secretary of Defense with Clinton. And he was the guy who took care of the loose nukes during the 1990s and created this very collaborative involvement with the Russians. And he, in this book, that is an extraordinary book, he blames the U.S. for the initial encroaching of NATO to the borders of Russia. He was totally opposed to that, and that decision and others in Kosovo, etc., for him were decisive in the fact that the Russians lost the trust they had with us, and they are now going to so now the situation is becoming for him increasingly dangerous for William Perry. And in Syria is a case where this is happening, but basically I feel like we are so ignorant of the realities of ISIS and Syria right now, what is going on, that it's hard to see what to make sense of it. So that's how I feel myself in this terrible situation.
And when you say we are ignorant of the realities, what is it that you're referring to specifically?
Well, I mean, we are told always that the Russians are the bad guys and Al-Assad is the bad, but then you read somebody like Jimmy Carter, who knows the Assads better than perhaps anybody else, and he wrote this op-ed article in the New York Times where his view was very different from ours.
So unfortunately, we're not able to finish the interview today, but I will be posting it on our Facebook page. We've been listening to Joseba Zulaika. If you want to learn more about this show, give us feedback or share ideas for topics and speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Our theme music is from Merkava by the Israeli musician and peace activist Gabby Myers. Join us next time for an interview with Brian Becker.